Hey, what do you say we wrap up October reading? Listen, I know we're basically in the middle of November now, but I still think it's worthwhile to touch on some of the books I maybe haven't featured in a Feature Friday. If I sound a little odd today, I am getting over a pretty nasty cold, so I apologize. And the timing isn't great, obviously, because we have a busy week coming up with the Goodreads Choice Awards dropping on Tuesday, I believe. So stay tuned, knock on wood, for a video coming out later this week about the first round of voting, kind of dependent on when I can get it filmed based on my work schedule. Now, October reading, I usually am kind of in the midst of a slump in October, November, which is weird in the sense that October, November reading is kind of my wheelhouse. It's like my favorite time of year, my favorite time of reading as well, because of the gothic atmospheric reads of the season and the romances I can still pepper throughout. So the good news is I don't think I have been in a full-fledged slump this year. The bad news is I still feel kind of odd about my reading lately. I definitely read some standouts in October, but I also read a number that were just kind of middling for me or didn't excite me in the way that I expected. And so I have a kind of vague sense of the whole month in terms of my reading. And a lot of it may be as well that a lot of my like darker atmospheric Halloween themed reads I had on hold at the library and they just didn't come in on time. And so the whole month feels a little lopsided in some ways. But at the same time, I also read a decent number of books out of my owned TBR, which is something that I've been trying to be better at. Now, to be fair, it's not a huge number, but it is still whittling down those stacks. So let's go ahead and jump into the month. The first book I read for the month was actually on audio, and it is a pop culture kind of essay exploration, which we know I love, and this was no exception. I listened to Wannabe, Reckonings with the Pop Culture That Shaped Me by Aisha Harris. Aisha Harris is incredibly sharp and insightful and funny, and so this was a real joy. I'm also at the age where these kind of pop culture explorations are looking at the pop culture that shaped me, and so because of that, they're more relatable. I definitely think I'll need to re-listen to this, but I enjoyed that each chapter was kind of a different essay kind of idea, and then the pop culture kind of came in through the exploration of that idea rather than shaping the essay through a specific piece of pop culture. Now, granted, different essays had different focal points or pop culture that kind of anchored the exploration. And I'm also not saying that I don't enjoy it when the pop culture is leading the essay, but I enjoyed this framing and her voice within this framing. And so it just worked for me. Also, if you're in search for an audiobook for work or a drive, I definitely recommend this one. It listens similar to a deep dive podcast in many ways, and I really enjoyed that. Next, we have Last Sunrise and Eterna by Amparo Ortiz, which I did talk about in a Feature Friday. I am a little bummed to report that this book did not live up to my expectations, and I was very excited about this one because it was elves in Puerto Rico, and it was a protagonist that was essentially selling elvish corpses on the black market. Like, what a conceit. But then it moves into Sevem, our protagonist, participating in this exchange between the elves and the humans that kind of keeps this treaty between the two worlds going in a lot of ways and focuses on the fact that elves can't dream and humans can dream, and so it's kind of looking into those dreams, but also involves many challenges similar to what you would see possibly in a dystopian novel or a more fairy tale-esque novel. And that makes sense within the idea of elves having challenges, using tricky language, kind of having to outsmart them. However, the way the challenges were presented in the book didn't necessarily feel tied to what Sevem was doing there, trying to rescue her mother, and it also didn't necessarily feel tied to the elves' mission. And then we also had this aspect where the elves had this like rebellious group that they were fighting with, and so there was a lot going on that didn't really gel together completely for me, which was a bummer because the instincts here were really good. The premise of this was so compelling. I just think it kind of floundered in some aspects of its world creation and its character building, and everything ended up feeling a little bit flat, unfortunately. But if you want further thoughts about this title, go ahead and check out the Feature Friday that I did for it. And then another book we talked about in a Feature Friday, Vampires of El Norte by Isabel Cañas, which is the anticipated sophomore novel from the author of The Hacienda. And I think this was a super successful sophomore novel. I loved The Hacienda because I love gothics, but at the same time, I did have some critiques about the way that I felt the romance in that was handled, and that in particular, I felt that the attraction was born of being told there was an attraction rather than feeling it organically or building it organically. And here, I did not have that problem at all. all, we follow two childhood friends, Nestor and Nena. And Nena is the daughter of the hacienda. Nestor works on the grounds. And we start with them as they're starting to feel this class difference in their relationship. Nena's mother is kind of trying to pull her back from hanging out with Nestor, spending time with him, even though he is her best friend and her closest confidant. And so we start the book with them sneaking out at night in search of buried treasure, where they come upon some monsters. Nena is injured. Nestor assumes she is dead and flees, and this haunts him for years to come. And only does he find out there was potentially a different outcome to this evening when he returns home in wake of an upcoming battle to keep his elder family members from having to join in on the fight. In the meantime, Nena is attempting to assert her independence, or at least prove her importance to her home outside of how she can marry. And so she has been studying to be a healer, which is going to be needed in these upcoming battles. But at the same time, there are some mystery illnesses that are cropping up that may be more tied to this long ago night than even Nena realizes. I will say the vampires in this were so different than I went in expecting, especially with the kind of gothic romance of the hacienda, and I really appreciated how they were handled. I talk about it much more in depth in the Feature Friday, but I think it really was successful. I do have some small critiques in the way the middle third of the book was handled, in that it felt like some of the relationship beats between Nena and Nestor repeated, and so we got kind of dragged down in that a little bit. I kind of understand why we had to live there, but I think that if we had kind of smoothed that out, we would have had the opportunity to build some different relationship beats for them, and also to kind of build out some of the other relationships in the book a little bit deeper. But at the end of the day, I really, really enjoyed this, and I thought that the historical setting in particular was just so fantastic. I loved the way that Cañas described the land here, described the kind of vastness, and also the metaphors of the political tides at the time within the supernatural explorations here, that doesn't take away from the central kind of relationships, but just further emphasizes them. And I think that everything blends together really well. It feels really balanced in that sense. So definitely recommend, and Cañas continues to be one that I definitely have my eyes on, and I'm very, very interested to see where she is going to go from here. And then I listened to You're Not Supposed to Die Tonight by Kalynn Bayron, which is somehow my first Kalynn Bayron, and it is a kind of twist of the slasher film. It follows Charity, who plays the final girl at this kind of extreme haunt experience where people will go to this camp that mirrors a very popular slasher film and kind of live out this night. Now, I am not a haunted house person. I worked one haunted house in college that was designed by theater ed majors, and yet even walking through beforehand when it was unmanned and being put in the least creepy room, I could not leave to use the bathroom my entire shift, because if I had left my assigned station, there was no way to indicate that I was working and not a patron, and thus I did not want to be scared, because I am so easily scared. So that being said, I was almost more interested in the behind the scenes parts of this novel. It obviously, or maybe not obviously, shifts into this becoming a real kind of slasher film for them, a real kind of night of terror, to varying success for me as it kind of amps up, and how we kind of see everything falling into place and who the instigator of this violence is. It's obviously, I think, supposed to be a little campy to kind of match the tenor of the fictional original source material, and yet at the same time it is kind of delving into some deeper issues that pay off a little bit but maybe don't have the full space to fully breathe. At the same time, I do appreciate that the action moves very quickly here. It knows what it is, it knows what it wants to do, and it gets in and out and does it. And I think that's particularly valuable within the young adult space. Not every young adult reader wants a 500 plus page fantasy novel. This allows them something quick and action-packed and fast-paced. But like I said, I really enjoyed the kind of behind the scenes of how they were making this happen. Charity, our protagonist, starts out, like I said, as the final girl, and so we watch them kind of interact with some of these people who have booked this haunted experience, and the way some of them will kind of integrate themselves with the group paying for this experience, pretending to be another participant, and the ways they kind of move behind the scenes to make some of the tricks of this experience happen, especially when it is a haunted campground, and so you have more ground to cover rather than a more isolated haunted house where you can control a little bit more easily. Watching them kind of run around in the backstage area and make things happen was really entertaining. And for someone like me, despite my theater background, also a good reminder of how some of these effects happen and what the kind of mechanics of everything is. Moving on, I read A Study in Drowning by Ava Reid. Again, I have a Feature Friday exploring this in more depth, but as you can maybe see by my copy here, there was a lot of gorgeous language here, a lot that really resonated with me. I really, really enjoyed this. Again, like I said, in my feature Friday, I think that if you enjoyed Divine Rivals, you will also enjoy this book. Both have an aspect of rivals to lovers that starts in this nature of competition and turns into an appreciation and an ability to see the other person in a way that others around them maybe can't. And both are kind of tenured by grief through the lens of mythology or storytelling. Here we have Effie, who is an architecture student, which we come to find out is because women are not allowed to be literature students, and so it's the next most reputable field of study. And she comes across a call for architecture proposals to redesign the house of her favorite author, who is also a recently canonized author within her country, and the kind of mythology around storytelling within her country and this kind of fantasy-esque world. Though the world also has tenors of the modern through things like trains and phones. And so she presents this proposal and is ultimately chosen. And in putting together this proposal, she has formed this kind of antagonistic, one-sided relationship with this literature student, Preston, who, when she finally goes to this home, she finds out is also in residence. And he is being granted access to a lot of private papers and welcomed into the home by the widow in a way that Effie is not. And she is dealing more with the son, which turns into a more uncomfortable, complicated relationship, especially in relation to Effie's past trauma that the book does explore. But in relation to this student, she does come to find out that he is kind of digging and looking to posit something that really affects her and upsets her in relation to this work that has been so seminal to especially her identity and providing a solace for her, because he's essentially theorizing that this author maybe didn't write this most popular work, and Effie does not like that. However, the literature student Preston is like, well, I just want to find the truth. So if you can help me find the truth, prove to me that he did write it, and that will satisfy me. And so through this search for the truth, they become closer. At the same time, the idea of truth starts to become warped, especially as Effie is seeing things out of the corner of her eyes and sometimes straight on that lead her to question reality, and reality in relation to this very popular work especially. I will admit that I think that I had a bleeding of the blurbs of this and Starling House by Alex E. Harrow, which we will also hopefully be talking about in more depth later this week, so stay tuned. So we're not necessarily traveling into the story that is kind of centering everything here. However, that is not to say that the story doesn't bleed into Effie's reality in other ways. I really enjoyed this. I've already talked way too long about this considering it has its own dedicated video, so if you want to hear me babble about this one more, go check out that feature Friday. Then I went ahead and listened to Black Sheep by Rachel Harrison, which is my first Harrison. I've heard great things about especially Cackle, so I was really excited going in, especially because this had a cult angle and, to my assumption, a kind of a cult angle as well. And it started out so strong for me with our more prickly protagonist Vesper working in this rundown dive bar and a run-in with some not so great patrons that come in that also organically introduce us to Vesper's mother being this really renowned like horror movie star, and also introduces this kind of supernatural element in that some nacho cheese may end up in places the nacho cheese was not supposed to be, and it was not thrown on anyone directly. However, said nacho cheese incident leads to Vesper getting fired and perfectly primes her to have nothing better on her schedule when she goes home and finds an invitation to the wedding of her cousin, who she was super close to growing up, and her old boyfriend, who she left behind when she left this cult. And so she goes back for this wedding. And the lead up to this is really great in the sense that we have this anticipation of what this cult is going to be. And then we get there and we meet the cult. And for me, it all kind of crumbles. One, Vesper isn't particularly likable in the sense that she's going back and she's kind of needling this cousin who she claims to care for, has been really close to, and we can tell through the narrative has always felt this kind of sense of playing second fiddle to Vesper. And so she's finally getting her perceived happily ever after, we think anyway, with this guy who Vesper left behind, had no claim on, and yet Vesper is almost kind of punishing her for that in a way that, sure, the jealousy makes sense, but the kind of vindictiveness of it doesn't really. And I'm all for an unlikable character, but this wasn't particularly interesting. Meanwhile, the cult itself, I think, was supposed to feel campy, I hope, and yet didn't, because essentially, spoiler alert, if you don't want to know, fair warning here, skip ahead, they are Satanists, but in a way that felt like a caricature of the Satanic Panic in the 80s and just didn't land for me. Also, I know language changes and I appreciate wanting to meet younger readers where they are. I think there are a lot of younger contemporary romances in particular that don't really have a sense of their main age demographic in terms of their leads. However, that being said, there was something kind of jarring for me listening to the word cheugy being used earnestly in this book. Anyway, there was a twist. It plays out pretty early in the book in terms of pacing. It wasn't surprising, and ultimately I didn't really have a full sense of what the journey of this book was really supposed to be. I think that if it had kind of played with the campiness more, made it feel a little bit more intentional, played with the character work a little bit more so that that read better, and then also had a clearer sense of the journey, I think that this would have landed a little better for me, but ultimately where it was, it just didn't really work for me. But moving on to a listen that did, A Witch's Guide to Fake Dating a Demon by Sarah Hawley, which I originally listened to because I was gonna try and do another witchy romance feature like I did a couple years ago that ultimately, unfortunately, just didn't pan out in the timing of everything. But this follows a young witch, Muriel, who is the heir to a kind of witchy dynasty in her small town, and yet she is struggling in the magic department, particularly with summoning. And in this effort to try to improve her summoning skills, she accidentally summons a demon. This demon can't leave without making a soul bargain that Muriel is not going to make, and so thus ends up in Muriel's space. What I especially appreciated in this was Muriel's relationship, particularly with her mother, in that it was infuriating, don't get me wrong, because Muriel's entire family really speaks down to her in terms of her magical abilities or lack thereof in their perception, and don't appreciate where her abilities do lie with her green thumb and her kind of nature magic. And so we are constantly watching them speaking down to her, and part of her journey and relationship with Azeroth is kind of realizing her own worth and Azeroth standing up for her, even if that doesn't always land well for Muriel. So it's kind of building to her standing up for herself, which is incredibly satisfying. Ultimately, this wasn't necessarily anything revolutionary, but it was a whole lot of fun, especially on audio. I listened to it straight through basically in one day. And then I read Maddalena and the Dark by Julia Fine, which again, we do have a dedicated feature Friday on, so I will try not to dwell on this too much, but this is a historical fiction that has elements of the weird, the odd, the supernatural, following two girls that are in a music school in Vienna in the 18th century. I especially loved the historical setting of this, as it's something that I don't read in too often, and I always love Fine's language, and I loved how it was at play here, and I think it works really well within historical fiction. That being said, there were aspects of this that didn't fully land for me. The relationship between Maddalena, who is the daughter of a wealthy Venetian family, and Louisa, who is a foundling within this music school, is kind of rushed in certain parts, or it feels like we kind of skip over things that help us understand the deepness of their bond and their connection, which is also kind of tempered by the supernatural element of this kind of devil's bargain of a sorts, and how this desire and this wish from particularly Louisa in relation to her musical ability and trying to stand out within this environment of a bunch of people who have been studying music their whole lives leads them down this darker path. So it's really exploring the depths of this female friendship, but also the choices that young women have, especially in this environment. And it all has this kind of biting edge to it. Fine describes this book as inspired by Olivia Rodrigo, which I can definitely see, but I would have liked to see a little bit more of that sharpness. Some of it does feel a little tempered or buffered down by the language and the kind of fluidity and attempt to weave in this musicality, and some of it ends up feeling actually kind of staccato. I know that that is contradictory because I just said fluidity and then I say staccato. This kind of moving around within the narrative and switching back and forth between Louisa and Maddalena's points of view in this kind of attempt for these narratives to be in conversation with each other, which they ultimately are, but it also leaves these kind of gaps sometimes, which as readers, or at least I as a reader, wasn't always able to follow them over in terms of the kind of emotional through line of the book. And a lot of that heightened emotion is needed to kind of understand the payoff of some of the things, including the climax, in terms of what is driving these two young women. moment. So it was still ultimately an enjoyable read for me. I just wish it had pushed itself even a little further in a couple ways. And I definitely think Fine is able to go to those places. I really appreciate the way that she incorporates the weird and the odd in her narratives in completely different ways every time. And I think that she almost could have pushed herself further in that direction for me here in this book. And then last but not least, my romance book club read a book that has been in my physical stack for probably about a year now, After Hours on Milagro Street by Angelina and Lopez. This was everything everyone said it was, and I don't know why I waited so long to read this book. It follows Alex, a mixologist from Chicago, going back home to her grandmother's small town bar after a kind of blow up at her job, and she discovers Professor Jeremiah Post living in the residence in her grandmother's bar. And she also realizes that the taking over of her grandmother's bar and the dreams she has for this in relation to getting back onto her feet and establishing a name for herself may not be as secure as she thought, because what she thought was her unquestionable inheritance is now being sought for sale from one of the big companies and developers in town. And in response, Jeremiah has also put in an offer for the Historical Society to protect this place that he has grown to love so much and the community it has offered him. However, Alex doesn't really know him yet at the beginning of the book, despite a very spicy scene right out of the gate. And so she sees him as an interloper. She doesn't recognize what this place means to him at first, and that is part of the journey of the book. And she is pretty spiky at the beginning. She has a lot of baggage and history in this small town that unravels over the course of the book. And I especially enjoy how community and small towns are portrayed here, the good, the bad, and the ugly in the full gamut. But I especially appreciate the community explored within this bar. I was telling my romance book club that I was sad because while this is going to be a series and I'm super excited, I've already picked up the next book, I also wanted a romance for Alex's cousin Joe, who is a contractor and also a friend of Jeremiah and helping with the Historical Society. So if you're listening, I would like a Joe romance. I will settle for a novella, that's fine. I just want him to have a happily ever after as well. But I really loved the way this was handled. There was a strong plot, a strong outside instigator, strong relationships, the banter and kind of push and pull between Alex and Jeremiah was really delicious. I love that we started with a bang, and then we had to kind of go back to square one, but at the same time, they clearly both got under each other's skin. And I really just loved the balance of the two of them in this. This is everything I wanted. I almost would be interested to see what it would look like with a cover from like the Alicia Ray Forbidden Hearts series, but I am very excited to continue this because what I didn't mention is what got us to read it, especially for October, was this concept of a ghost within this bar, which is not overdone, but definitely present. And I really enjoyed the way that the supernatural and superstition and all of this history really blended together within this narrative. And I am especially interested to see how that is going to play out in book 2, so it's a good thing that I already have a copy, you know, on my ever-growing TBR. So that is what I read in October, a kind of mixed bag, but did read some real gems this month. I would be super interested if you have read any of these books, what your thoughts on them are, so let me know below if you have thoughts, or if you read anything that really elicited a strong response, positive or negative, in October that you just want to shout about in the comments, let me know too. But as always, thanks for hanging out and being interested in what I have to say about books. Like and subscribe if you feel like it. Read something good, and yeah, bye.